Hello, my name is Benjamin Hart. I'm an American attorney and the managing director of Integrity Legal here in Bangkok, Thailand. Let me just preface this video by saying we're having some air conditioning issues here in the office, so if I'm looking a little more, if I'm perspiring a little more than usual, I do apologize, but it's just kind of, we're stuck dealing with what we're dealing with. The reason for the video, I got a rather interesting comment on one of the videos, specifically the one we were talking about human rights a couple weeks ago, or whatever it was, a week ago. Wanted to go ahead and read it. To be clear, there was actually a really cogent response to this comment that responded to this comment, and I think that viewer, I thought it was a nice response. I wanted to go ahead and respond to this on my own as well, point by point, frankly. Quoting directly, you use exaggerations and jargons, quote, stabbed in the head, unquote, polymerase chain reaction, quote unquote, to avoid addressing the central question, when does your freedom stop in order to protect another person's, quote, right to security of person, unquote? Does your discomfort from a nose swab really equate to a loss of another person's life? Is that what you're saying? And as an American lawyer, I know that you are fully aware that there are limits to one person's freedom when it affects somebody else's freedom. You can't yell fire in a crowded theater. Likewise, you can't run around unvaccinated, untested, and spewing your germs to the detriment of others. There are lots of people who are unable to fight the virus via vaccine, not the least of which are small children. I think that your argument is legally obfuscating and morally bankrupt. Okay. As I said, there was already one what I thought was pretty cogent response to this, and I almost decided to go ahead and read it, but that, just sort of reading the comments of my YouTube channel is not exactly, what this thing's meant to be. I did want to sort of respond to this point by point. You use exaggerations and jargon, quote, stabbed in the head, unquote, polymerase chain reaction, quote unquote, to avoid addressing the central question. Well, let's start there. This isn't exaggeration and jargon. When something is entering your body, an object is entering your body through your nose or otherwise, that's a stabbing. You're being stabbed in the head when they're poking something all the way up into your sinus cavity. I'm sorry, that's not an exaggeration. That's what it is. Okay? Further, jargon, polymerase chain reaction, that's the name of the test. That's why it's called PCR test, polymerase chain reaction. I would kind of argue it's a bit of a misnomer to call it a polymerase chain reaction test. It's just a polymerase chain reaction. But okay, I'm not going to get too far into that. Maybe you could argue that's a semantic point. It's being used in a test capacity. There are some out there who have argued that maybe that's not the best thing to do. Not going to get into that because it's beyond the bailiwick of this. To avoid addressing the central question. Okay, when does your freedom stop in order to protect another person's right to security of person? Well, in point of fact, you're inverting what's going on here. So what I'm trying to say is, when does your freedom stop in order to protect another person's right to security of person? How do I have security of person if someone else's fear is driving a policy that allows people to invade the orifices of my body with a stabbing object, with a probing object, call it that, fine. How is that security of my person? Why does somebody else and their desire that there be no disease in the world, for example, or a level of concern about disease that I would argue is pretty much unreasonable, that is impacting whether or not I have security in my person. So I find it odd that this becomes the central question. When does your freedom stop? When does your freedom to be afraid of disease stop? Do I have to abide by an invasion of my bodily integrity if enough people in the world are afraid of disease? And that's not me begging the question. I'm posing a genuine question. At what point does that end? I'm sorry, it's just not reasonable to think that just because a group of people is afraid of disease, they should be able to tell other people what to do with their body. Unilaterally. This is how it is. Without any kind of due process. And let's be clear, we were talking about human rights before, and there are notions of due process under that Declaration of Human Rights. I've discussed this in other videos about in the American context. Most assuredly, there is a search and seizure going on when you detain someone, stick something in their body in order to test the genetic material within their body. That is, by all definitions, a search and seizure. There's due process supposed to be associated with that in an American context. I would say that's pretty well the case here in Thailand, although I'm not going to get too far into that. That's really more for Thai lawyers, but I have discussed this with them. Now, look, at some point we've discussed this. It's become concomitant in the ability to travel, usually because there's a private carrier involved where they say, look, we need you to be tested in order to go to this country or that country. And some countries, Thailand included, have exercised their sovereignty to say, look, if you want to come in, you have to abide by certain public health standards that we're going to set, at least for the moment. But I don't understand why it is on just people walking around who just want to live their life and be left alone, especially asymptomatic people who don't have any reason to believe that there's anything wrong with them, why it is incumbent upon them to be detained, to be searched, to be poked and prodded, just because a group of people in society is very afraid of disease. Quoting further, does your discomfort from a nose swab really equate to the loss of another person's life? Well, yeah, that's just that's a nonsensical question. It's not a matter of and or. I either get a nose swab or somebody dies. That's not what we're talking about here. Okay, we're talking about basic human rights to the integrity of their body and to not have, quite frankly, things pushed into their body without them really wanting that to happen. So, there comes a certain point where you have to ask yourself, in terms of freedom and life, what kind of life is worth living if the moment you step outside your door, or even before that, anyone can come up to you, stop you, and shove something up your nose? Is that a life we really want to live? Honestly, I don't really want to live that way. So again, it's not a discomfort of a nose swab really equate to loss of another person's life. Well, no, it doesn't, because that's not an equation, and that's not the equation. As we've discussed, I'll get into this here in a minute on proximate cause, but hold on. Is that what you're saying? And as an American lawyer, I know that you are fully aware that there are limits to one person's freedom when it affects somebody else's freedom. Well, yeah, and I would say that back to the commenter. Your freedom to be hysterical about the situation stops at my nose. Your hysteria does not get to penetrate my head. Literally penetrate my head with a swab, okay? That's what I would say to that first. And the next thing is, the entire premise is bogus. We have talked about this in other videos. I'll put links to one of the main videos I talked about this on. Proximate cause. This is a common law notion. You learn about it in the first year of law school in torts. Proximate cause. Okay? The proximate cause of the virus is the virus, not people wandering around who happen to get into the chain of the virus and what it does. The virus is the virus. People are not the problem. The virus is the problem. The analogy I used in the video before was a tornado hitting somebody's barn, destroying it, and then the barn goes everywhere. I'm from Kansas, so tornado analogies are natural to me. The barn goes everywhere, and it kills a cow, and one guy, a piece of the barn, a plank off the barn kills a cow in one guy's property. It smashes somebody's window in a house. Can they sue the barn owner? No, because the proximate cause of the destruction is the tornado, not the barn that just happens to be in the way of the tornado. Much in the same way, an innocent bystander who happens to be in the chain of transmission of a virus is not proximately cause it. They did not cause the damage. Now, people that are tested, that know that they have something, that's a different story. I'm not getting into that. Because if you know you have something, or even if you have a reasonable degree of suspicion, you can maybe make the argument. Somebody has really bad symptoms of something, they should stay home. I understand that argument. But this notion of people just walking around asymptomatic who have no issue are somehow affirmatively liable for something, a being, an organism that is beyond their control, aka the virus, something that thing does, that is unreasonable. That is not how legal systems work. That's why proximate cause exists. Similar notions exist in the civil law, like here in Thailand, as well as in the common law. This is out there because we don't want to hold people liable for things they can't control. And that's the situation we're in right now, where there is a group of people that wants to hold people liable and wants to, quite frankly, restrict their freedoms over something they can't control. So moving forward, you can't yell fire in a crowded theater. Yeah, that's right. But that analogy does not apply here. There is no one who is wanting to run out and yell virus into a crowd in order to stimulate a stampede. That's not what's happening. What's operating here is negative freedom. People just wanting to be left alone. And yes, you have a right to be left alone. You have a right to your integrity of your body being left sacrosanct, where nobody touches it. I'm sorry. It's just, fire in a crowded theater, it's not even the same. We're not talking about the same thing. It's a false analogy. Likewise, you can't run around unvaccinated, untested, and spewing your germs to the detriment of others. Look, living your life is not aggression. This is what I have disliked about the mask mandate from the get-go, this notion that exhaling is aggression. This notion that, look, we're all part of the social compact. It's been around far longer than any of the technology we currently have. I always find it funny when I talk to American lawyers who sometimes start down this path, and I say to myself, do you remember that George Washington had smallpox? I would argue the founding fathers who wrote the Constitution, the Declaration of Independence, and the Bill of Rights in the United States were far more keenly aware of the deadliness of disease than anyone here, especially post-antibiotics, is currently aware of. And yet they believed enough in the notions of basic liberty that they said, they didn't put an asterisk in those documents. They said, well, unless, there's a disease on the loose, unless that, we'll make exception there. No, that wasn't what they did. And I know this is kind of a general topic. I'm not talking about Thailand specifically, USA, international. I'm talking about it all. Just conceptually, this notion that you're somehow a bad actor for walking around and living your life because germs exist, disease exists, and yes, people spread disease. That's the way the world has worked since the dawn of time. And we should not be losing our fundamental rights and fundamental security in our own personages simply because there are people out here who believe that we should. I'm sorry, I can't get on board with that. There are lots of people who are unable to fight the virus via vaccine, not the least of which are small children. Oh, okay, understood. Again, how is that incumbent on, I can't do anything about that. This whole notion that the individual is subservient to the group goodwill, or to the collective good, really rankles me on a fundamental level, because these are the kind of notions that led to things that happened, like described in Gulag Archipelago, things like the Cultural Revolution in China, that led to mass-scale death because a lot of, frankly, self-righteous people were doing the right thing. They were helping everyone. At the end of the day, yes, there is a balance. I like, in one of the videos before, I love the end of the movie Schindler's List. There's a great scene at the end of the movie where he saved these people, and they give him a ring, and they write a scripture on it in the ring. They engrave it, and it basically it's from the Talmud, and it says, "He who saves one life saves the world entire." I like that because it encapsulates the balance we're talking about. There is a balance between the individual and the group. You know, if you single out an individual and persecute them only because of how they want to live their individual life, then that is a real problem. It is the inverse of what they're saying. That is to hurt the group entire in a way. And what I'm trying to say here, I understand the balance. And the other thing is, the facts on the ground at this point, I don't think justify any of this, frankly, any of this argument at this point. I mean, we're 2 years out from this thing. We know what it is. It is not the massive existential threat that we did worry about at the beginning, and I think reasonably so. You know, we're not there anymore. But more than that, again, you know, you say the notion of saving one life and saving the world entire thereby, that operates in the inverse. People that want to run around and single out people to destroy, basically, or in a way to, you know, put in a situation where they're made to do something that they don't want to do for arguably specious reasoning under current circumstances, most especially, you know, it really calls into question the entire paradigm of that society. So finally, and then in closing, I think that your argument is legally obfuscating and morally bankrupt. Well, legally obfuscating, I'm not trying to obfuscate anything. I haven't used any sophistry. I'm just describing the law as it is. I'm trying to be as transparent as I can be with respect to my opinion on this. You know, I'm not hiding here. You know, and then morally bankrupt, well, I think perhaps you're being, you know, and I don't want to get into back and forth or calling names, but it seems to me there's nothing morally bankrupt in believing in the sacredness of the individual's soul and an individual's right to live their life with dignity and without being persecuted and without being essentially battered by a society that thinks it's okay to poke and prod that person without any justifiable reason for it. So, you know, if that's morally bankrupt, then I guess that's what I am.